A black CEO quietly boarded his flight. He had a first-class ticket, a confirmed seat, a calm demeanor. But 3 minutes later, he was asked to step aside. Why? Because a designer handbag was already comfortable in his place. What would you do if the system that was supposed to respect you erased you with a smile? What if the person they underestimated happened to be the architect behind the very protocol that could shut them down? This isn't just a story about a seat. It's about the silent storms carried by people who are forced to choose between their dignity and their peace every single day. It's about the moment when a man didn't raise his voice and the world finally listened. 4 major airports cut ties. Millions watched. But what truly happened on Flight 407? And why did the calmest passenger become the loudest lesson the airline industry has ever faced? Stay with us as we unravel every moment of this gripping, emotional journey built on quiet power, exposed bias, and a reckoning no one saw coming. Like, share, and subscribe now, and let's begin the story together. The hum of the cabin was a familiar sound. Low, steady, indifferent, like the world before it decides who matters. Malcolm Trevors stepped onto Altair Airlines Flight 407 from Seattle to Frankfurt with the same quiet rhythm he carried into every boardroom. Tailored navy coat, cufflinks he didn't flaunt, a leather carry-on that had seen more countries than conversations. His eyes scanned forward. First class, row 2, seat A, always 2A. He had taken this route dozens of times. Frankfurt was his second home now. That week he was due to keynote a closed-door aviation reform summit, one that would decide how 6 countries regulate ESG-linked airline investments. He had prepared for everything, except for this. When Malcolm reached his row, he stopped. Seat 2A wasn't empty. It wasn't occupied by a person either. It was taken by a bright crimson designer bag, crocodile leather, gold hardware, and the kind of arrogance that didn't need a voice. It lounged there like it had earned its own boarding pass. In seat 2B sat a woman in ivory cashmere and oversized sunglasses. Blonde hair swept into a sleek bun. Phone held at a tilted angle. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. Malcolm stood for a beat. Not confused, not impatient, just assessing. Then, in his calm voice, the one that carried weight without asking for it, he said, "Excuse me, this is my seat." The woman sipped her champagne, still scrolling. Then finally, she turned her head slightly, not removing the sunglasses. "That's funny," she said. "You must be confused." "No," he replied evenly. "I'm not." Her lips curled faintly. "This section's for executive premier guests only. You may want to double-check with the attendant." He didn't blink, just reached into his coat pocket and retrieved the boarding pass. Seat 2A, Malcolm Trevors, executive premier, platinum. He held it out gently, but she didn't take it. Instead, her hand slid protectively over the bag like it was a pet she was defending. "I'm quite comfortable where I am," she added. "Coach might be a better fit. There's plenty of space. A few rows ahead, a laptop snapped shut." Someone in 3C whispered, "What did she just say?" Another voice replied softly, "Isn't that Trevors from Orientech?" Malcolm stood his ground, still holding the pass. "I'm not confused," he said again, his voice lower now. "But I'll wait for the crew if you prefer." She tilted her head, a smirk playing on her lips. "Please do." He nodded once and pressed the call button above the seat. The silence in the cabin tightened. It wasn't just about the seat. It never was. It was about assumptions. What a black man in a tailored coat was allowed to claim. What space he was silently expected to cede. And what happened when he didn't. Camila Reyes, the flight attendant on her 3rd month with Altair, approached with cautious optimism. She was new, but she could read tension like weather. Her smile was warm but taut. "Is everything all right here?" The woman in 2B turned before Malcolm could speak. "Yes. This gentleman seems to be under the impression that this seat is his. I feel a bit unsafe with him standing over me like this." The word unsafe hit harder than turbulence. Malcolm didn't flinch, but Camilla did. She glanced between them, visibly unsure. Then she asked, "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" He handed it over. Her eyes scanned. Her mouth parted just slightly. "Thank you. Mr. Trevors." "That's correct." She turned toward the woman, trying to formulate a solution, but Sloane Hargrave didn't wait. "I'm asking for him to be removed," she said crisply. "He's making a scene." There had been no scene, just presence. But already, 2 phones had come out, subtle, slanted, recording. Camilla hesitated, her hand clenching slightly at her side. Then she offered what airlines always offer in moments they hope won't become headlines. "Mr. Trevors," she said gently, "would you mind stepping into the jet bridge just for a moment while we sort this out?" Malcolm looked at her, not coldly, not with anger, just measured. "I mind," he said. He paused. "But I'll go." He picked up his bag without another word, turned toward the front of the plane, and walked down the bridge alone. Behind him, Sloane leaned back into the leather seat like a queen who had defended her kingdom. She lifted her phone, snapped a photo of her bag on 2A, and typed a caption. Some people don't know their place. You're first-class living. What she didn't know was that Malcolm Trevors wasn't just another passenger. He was the founder and CEO of Orion Tech Aerospace, the company that engineered the modular carbon frames used in 40% of Altair's aircraft. He was also the architect of Astra 9, the ethical compliance system used by multiple European airports to determine ESG flight status, real-time evaluations of airlines' behavior, conduct, and equity protocols. And in exactly 3 minutes, the system he had built would begin quietly tearing down the airline that had just asked him to step off for a handbag. The air in the jet bridge was colder than the cabin. Sterile white walls, no music, no voices, just the hum of air filters and quiet restraint. Malcolm stood there, facing nothing in particular, hands at his sides. The boarding pass was still in his pocket, not because he needed it anymore, but because it represented something that should have been simple. He should be sitting in 2A, not standing here like he was being reviewed for eligibility. His reflection in the jet bridge window looked calm, unbothered, even. But beneath the surface, a familiar ache stirred, one he hadn't let surface in years, not since he was 12, walking into an honors science camp and being mistaken for the janitor's son. He closed his eyes for just a moment. Then, like clockwork, his hand reached for the phone. It wasn't a flashy device, no logo, no ringtone, just a matte black slab of precision, designed for function, not flash. He pressed and held one button. A voice answered within 2 seconds. "Trevors. Activate Astra 9, he said. "Low and clear. Tier 3 protocol. Flight 407. Altair. Flag Frankfurt, Oslo, Vienna, Geneva." The other end replied immediately. "Confirmed. Action in motion." And just like that, silence became action. 3 minutes. That was all it needed. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had changed, but only slightly. Camila Reyes stood in the forward galley, trying to steady her breathing. The knot in her stomach was real now, not imagined, not part of the script they trained her for. This wasn't about a seat anymore. It was about the choice she had just made, and what she hadn't done. She hadn't asked the woman in 2B to move her bag. She hadn't said, "Ma'am, please respect the seating assignment." She had asked the man, the one with the calm voice and the steady eyes, to leave instead. Because it was easier. Because it was safer. Because in the back of her mind, she heard the unspoken threat in the other woman's tone. If you don't handle this, I'll escalate. And Camilla needed this job. She looked down at the tablet clipped to the service wall. A new alert had appeared. Passenger Trevors, Malcolm, Tier 1, Clearance ID ETH8X9, Affiliation, Orion Tech Aerospace, Astra 9, Global ESG Compliance Status Flagged, Active Evaluation in Progress. Camilla froze. She had no idea what half of that meant, but she knew what it implied. The man she'd asked to step off. He wasn't just important. He owned something they depended on, something they might not land without. In row 4C. Deshaun Blake adjusted his camera lens. He had been filming casually when it started, just grabbing some pre-takeoff B-roll for his YouTube channel. Aviation Life 360 had been growing steadily the past year, mostly reviews of seat pitch, meal quality, and whether business class was ever worth the miles. But today was different. He had caught the moment the man showed his boarding pass. Caught the moment the woman said, "Try coach." And he had certainly caught the moment the flight attendant asked him to step outside, like he was causing a disturbance. Deshaun didn't say anything, didn't intervene. He just kept filming and uploading. Within minutes, the video was live. Title: He had a first-class ticket. She had a designer bag. Guess who got kicked out? Hashtags were already trending. High coach seat denied. Oh, Astra protocol. Oh, silence speaks. He didn't know who the guy was yet, but Twitter would. They always did. Sloane Hargrave, still reclined in 2B, smiled to herself. Her bag was once again resting comfortably on 2A, like a loyal pet. She scrolled through her notifications. 2 likes on her photo already. The caption read, "Some people just don't understand boundaries. First class is earned." She tucked the phone away and reached for her second glass of champagne. The crew hadn't returned. No apology, no confrontation, just calm. Exactly how she liked it. But what Sloane didn't notice was the energy around her had shifted. The man across the aisle, in 1D, wasn't typing anymore. He was watching her. The couple in 3A and 3B whispered quietly. And Camilla hadn't returned. Something was happening. She just didn't know what. Not yet. In Frankfurt. The Ethics Operations Center inside Terminal 1 flickered to life. Vivian Ngo, Director of ESG Compliance, was halfway through her espresso when the alert popped onto her screen. Red flag, Altair Flight 407, passenger of interest Malcolm Trevors. Trigger source Astra. 9. Incident classification, pending Tier 3 review. She nearly spilled the espresso. Her assistant leaned in. Astra 9 just went live. Vivian's mind raced. Astra 9 wasn't some watchdog blog. It wasn't a viral outrage machine. It was a private, encrypted compliance system used by investment consortiums and aviation oversight boards across 5 countries. And Trevors owned it. The man had authored 40% of the ESG ethical review criteria used to determine which airlines qualified for billions in sustainability-linked funding. If he flagged a flight, it didn't just mean reputational risk. It meant money stopped, landing rights stalled, access revoked. Vivian stood up sharply. Get Oslo, Vienna, and Geneva on the line. Meanwhile, Malcolm stood quietly in the jet bridge. Phone lowered now, still unreadable. A gate manager had approached him awkwardly, offering weak smiles and overcompensating politeness. "We're just sorting out a minor mix-up, sir," the man said. "Thank you for your patience." Malcolm nodded once. Nothing more. He didn't offer details. He didn't pull rank. He didn't have to. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a test. And the system was answering for him. Inside the cockpit, Captain Henrik Muller was reviewing his weather routing when his headset buzzed. "Captain," came the operations voice, clipped and urgent. "You have a high-priority passenger on board. Tier 1. System flag active." Henrik blinked. "Name Malcolm Trevors. Ethics Executive. ESG Rating Authority. Protocol Astra 9. Just went live against your flight." Henrik didn't swear. He didn't ask who Trevors was, because he already knew. Everyone in the European aviation space did. And this was no longer about a seating dispute. This was a compliance event. And the flight might not leave until it was resolved. Back in first class, the passengers were growing restless. The lights had dimmed again. The flight attendant hadn't returned with new drinks. The captain hadn't made an announcement. And there was still an empty seat beside Sloane. Except now, it didn't feel like her victory anymore. It felt like something she didn't understand. Her phone buzzed. A direct message. Then another. One simply read, "You might want to Google the guy you just got removed." She frowned. She opened her browser, typed slowly, "Malcolm Trevors," and froze. Her screen filled with headlines. The quiet titan behind ESG ethics compliance. The man who decides. If. Your flight can land. Astra 9. The algorithm reshaping aviation accountability. She stared, heart sinking. This was the man. The one she told to try coach. The one she asked to be removed. And just as the realization dawned, the tablet at the front of the galley blinked again. Updated message: Seat 2A is reassigned to original ticket holder by direct request of Captain. And somewhere in the terminal, Malcolm Trevors turned around and walked calmly back toward the plane. Malcolm stepped back into the aircraft, the cool breeze from the terminal fading behind him. There was no fanfare, no whispers. Just the heavy quiet that filled a room after something important had been realized too late. Camilla stood near the entrance of the cabin, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. Her expression was unreadable, but her posture had changed, less confident, more aware. "Sir," she said, her voice steadier than before. "Your seat is ready." Malcolm gave a single nod. "No more." He walked past her with the composed stride of a man who knew how much damage had already been done without him raising his voice once. Every head in the front cabin turned. No one said a word. Even the baby 2 rows back had stopped crying. He reached row 2. Seat A was empty again. The crimson duffel bag was gone. Sloane sat alone in 2B, spine ramrod straight, eyes forward. She didn't look at him, but her fingers fidgeted on her lap, twisting the gold ring on her middle finger over and over. Malcolm sat down quietly. The buckle clicked. His briefcase slipped neatly beneath the seat in front of him. And then he exhaled, like someone returning to equilibrium after 3 minutes of silence that rewired an entire machine. Camilla stepped back into the galley. Captain Muller remained in the cockpit, eyes scanning real-time updates on the crew tablet. Frankfurt had flagged the flight. Oslo and Vienna were initiating compliance scans. Geneva had already revoked Altair's fast-track corridor until further notice. It wasn't weather. It wasn't mechanical. It was ethics. He leaned back in his seat and muttered to himself, "This flight may take off, but something much bigger has already landed." Sloane could feel the difference without having to be told. No one was looking at her the way they had before. The slight nods, the smiles of approval, The subtle class signals that passed between frequent flyers and first class, they had vanished, replaced by stillness, wariness. She wanted to check her phone again, to see if anything else had come in, but she couldn't. Not yet. Her mind was stuck on the headline she had read just before Malcolm returned. "He writes the rules. Your airline must follow." It didn't feel real. It couldn't be. Not the man she had dismissed so easily. The man she had accused of making her uncomfortable simply because he had the nerve to stand where he belonged. And yet, here he was, sitting beside her, not gloating, not even glancing her way, just calm. And in that calm, she felt the weight of everything. In row 3C. Deshawn watched the quiet reunion unfold like it was a symphony. He had just finished uploading a second video, this one labeled "Update He's Back," and the whole cabin feels it. He wasn't embellishing. He didn't need to. The tension wasn't loud. It was heavy, like air before a thunderstorm. People felt it. And while he normally stayed out of drama, something about this moment felt different. This wasn't someone being rude to staff. This wasn't a toddler kicking a seat. This was about power and who people thought deserved it. He whispered to his camera, "This isn't about a seat. It's about the stories people tell themselves when they decide who belongs where." Vivian Ngo paced inside the ESG compliance war room at Frankfurt Terminal 1. The map in front of her had 4 red blinking points: Seattle, Frankfurt, Oslo, and Vienna. The system was reacting fast. Too fast for PR teams to spin. Too fast for Altair Airlines to contain. Her assistant rushed in. "Vivian, Astra 9 just logged pattern data. Trevors' team uploaded 5 past incidents from Altair in the last 18 months, all flagged for class-based passenger displacement." Vivian's jaw tightened. This wasn't just one incident. This was a pattern, and the system recognized it. "Send the packet to Geneva," she said, "and notify Munich. They'll want eyes on this." Back on Flight 407, Camilla moved slowly through the cabin, offering water to the front row. Her hands trembled slightly as she neared Malcolm. She stopped at his seat. He looked up. She hesitated, then placed the glass gently on the tray table. "Dr. Trevors," she said quietly. "We didn't know." His expression remained neutral, not cold, not smug, just present. It shouldn't take knowing someone's title to treat them with basic dignity, he said. She nodded, face flushing with something deeper than embarrassment. "I understand." He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, then returned to the screen on his tablet. Astra 9 was running live diagnostics now. Passenger manifest, crew sentiment tracking, pattern variance across past seating assignments. It wasn't dramatic, no sirens, no red fonts, just clean data, displayed in order, the way Malcolm preferred the world, facts without volume. Sloane glanced at her phone again, heart pounding. The first comment on her photo was now from someone she didn't recognize. "You kicked off the one man who could dismantle your entire airline? Iconic." She deleted the post in a panic. Too late. The screen refreshed. New messages. More mentions. Someone had pulled up her company bio. Someone else had linked her name to the foundation she chaired. It was unraveling, one frame at a time, and the worst part, she knew she couldn't undo it, because the moment had already spoken for her, and the cameras had listened. In the cockpit, Captain Mahler received a silent acknowledgement from Ground Ops. Astra 9 ethics review in progress. Flight flagged pending ESG compliance audit. He sighed, not out of frustration, out of clarity. He had flown for 27 years. through monsoons, through mechanical failures, through airspace shutdowns, but he had never seen a system pause over a handbag, and yet this felt more real than any weather alert. He picked up the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We'll be experiencing a brief delay due to operational logistics. Thank you for your patience." He didn't say what the delay really was, but many passengers already knew. In row 4A, a black woman in a gray blazer leaned slightly forward and tapped on Malcolm's armrest. He looked over. Her voice was soft. "I just wanted to say thank you." He blinked. For what, he asked. "For not yelling." She said, "For not stooping. For showing people there's another way." Malcolm smiled faintly. "There always is," he replied. Then she added, "Do you think they'll ever change?" He looked ahead. His answer came without emotion. Only truth. They will, because silence becomes too loud to ignore. In the Altair Airlines executive suite in London, chaos had begun. The head of PR was pacing. Their ESG officer was on the phone with Zurich. Compliance flags were spreading faster than news reports. One analyst said what no one else wanted to admit. This might not just cost us money. It might cost us the ability to land. And still, no official statement had been released, because no one knew how to explain what had just happened in a way that didn't prove Trevors right. Back on board, Malcolm opened a new window on his screen. The Astra 9 dashboard, live scores, live risks, and now a new protocol surfaced. He read the lines slowly. Passenger dignity risk escalation, Tier 2. Malcolm clicked once. The system submitted the first formal ethics risk flag against Altair Airlines in 7 years. It would ripple across compliance boards before the seatbelt light even turned off. And he hadn't spoken louder than a whisper. By the time the aircraft door closed again, the flight was no longer just a flight. It had become a case study, a pressure chamber, a mirror. Malcolm Trevors sat silently in 2A. A man fully returned to his rightful space. But nothing about his posture said victory. No glance toward the woman beside him. No correction to anyone. His calm was unnerving precisely because it didn't seek acknowledgement. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a suit turned to his wife and whispered, "He's the one who built that aerospace ethics software." "Right." His wife nodded slowly, her brows still drawn together, and thought. He didn't say a word. She replied, and everything stopped. In the cabin, the lights dimmed slightly again, not to prepare for takeoff, but to signal a delay without naming one. The plane wasn't moving, but the world around it was. At Altair Airlines headquarters in London, the crisis room had been activated. Screens lined the walls. Red tags blinked under airport codes. FRO, OSL, VE, GVO. Frankfurt had already flagged them. Vienna followed within 7 minutes. Oslo halted incoming gate priority for all Altair transatlantic traffic. No official reason yet. Just a note. Pending ethics reauthorization. Munich sent a request for immediate compliance documentation. Geneva issued a 2-line internal memo. Effective immediately, Altair Flight 407 shall not be cleared for disembarkation until risk review is resolved. The Altair COO slammed her palm on the table. "What the hell just happened in row 2, she shouted. A junior compliance officer, sweating under the collar, stammered. He triggered the Astra system, Tier 2 flag, and the airports believe him. Someone else added, "The ESG consortium pulled $80 million already. The rest are just waiting to see if it sticks." And then the room fell silent, because they knew it would stick. On board. Sloane Hargrave had stopped moving entirely. No scrolling. No eye contact. Her world had shrunk to the size of her own embarrassment. What she had thought was a minor inconvenience, a seating mistake, a moment of justified entitlement, was now spiraling into something she couldn't measure. The emails had started. Her assistant messaged, "Your name's trending." Then board members are asking for an explanation. Then Vivian just withdrew support from the foundation. She didn't even know how they found out so fast. She thought of deleting her account, of issuing a statement. But every word she considered felt defensive, hollow, or too late. And the man beside her hadn't even flinched, not once. Camilla stood frozen near the galley. Her fingers gripped the edge of the service cart as if anchoring herself. A notification blinked on the crew tablet again. Passenger of interest, Malcolm Trevors. Status Ethics Risk Protocol in Progress Instruction. Do not engage unless addressed. That last line chilled her. She had never seen anything like it. She didn't know such protocols even existed. And more than anything, she realized she had underestimated him instantly, unconsciously, completely. She hadn't asked Sloan to move her bag. She hadn't questioned her tone. Instead, she deferred, assuming the man in the tailored navy coat, calm and quiet, was somehow the problem. She exhaled, not because she was relieved, but because she finally recognized her own silence as part of the harm. In the cockpit, Captain Henrik Mahler reviewed a printed report on Astra 9. The system was unlike anything he had dealt with in his 20 years as a commercial pilot. It wasn't government-regulated. It wasn't media-controlled. It was infrastructure designed to measure behavior not after the fact, but during. And the man who had built it wasn't just enforcing it. He was the system. Henrik contacted dispatch. Confirm current gate restrictions. The voice on the other end was subdued. Geneva's on hold. Frankfurt, too. We're expecting Munich to flag us any minute. He asked a second question. What's our current ethics compliance score? There was a pause. 71%. Below minimum ESG protocol threshold. Henrik nodded slowly. 78 was the number you needed to avoid suspension. And right now, they weren't even close. Vivian Ngo stood at the center of a ring of screens inside the Frankfurt ESG control suite. The data was updating in real time. Passenger discrimination incident confirmed. No intervention by cabin crew prior to removal request. Tier 2 escalation verified. 3 past complaints surfaced against Altair in the past year involving similar demographic factors. Male, black, business class ticketed, reassigned due to other passengers' discomfort. The algorithm didn't ask for apologies. It looked for patterns. Vivian reviewed the compiled report and sent it to all 4 hub directors. The subject line was simple. Compliance failure? In progress. Passenger Trevors flag validated. She didn't need to ask for response. She already knew what would come next. Back in 2A. Malcolm opened a secure channel on his tablet. He didn't scroll. He didn't type. He simply reviewed the queue of inquiries that had arrived in the last 20 minutes. 6 ESG investment boards, 2 airport regulators, 1 federal compliance task force. They didn't want interviews. They wanted access to his protocol, to Astra 9. They had seen what happened when it was activated, and now they didn't want to be caught without it. He tapped out a short reply. Voluntary access to sandbox environment will be granted post-landing. Conditions: no code revisions, no delay. Full integration transparency required. Then he put the device down and looked out the window. Not because he expected a view, but because the sky was the only part of this situation that hadn't judged him today. Sloan felt her throat tighten as the cabin remained motionless. 10 minutes? 15. They hadn't even pushed back from the gate. She couldn't stand the silence anymore. She turned slightly toward him. "I didn't know who you were," she said. Her voice hushed, almost inaudible. Malcolm didn't look at her. He didn't respond. The moment had passed, and he had learned long ago that silence was more honest than forced accountability. Across the aisle, a woman in business attire glanced over at Sloane. Her expression wasn't cruel, just certain. There would be no rescue this time. In New York. Inside the Aviation Policy Division at Langston Group headquarters, Malcolm's chief of operations forwarded a simple alert to the executive team. Altair Airlines flagged. ESG exposure above 800 manners. Astra 9. Tier 2 breach confirmed. Global ethics systems in motion. In response. Malcolm's executive assistant replied with a short note. He didn't make a scene. He submitted a report, and that was enough. Back on the aircraft. Captain Muller stepped out of the cockpit briefly. He almost never did this before takeoff, but he felt it was important now. He walked up the aisle to row 2, paused beside Malcolm's seat. "Dr. Trevors," he said quietly, "I just wanted to personally acknowledge what happened earlier, and to let you know, on behalf of this flight, I'm sorry." Malcolm looked up, expression still composed. "You have nothing to apologize for, Captain," he replied. Muller nodded. Then, after a moment, added, "In all my years flying, I've never seen an entire industry hold its breath over a single protocol." Malcolm offered a faint smile. "Sometimes, Captain," he said, "it's not the plane that needs to move. It's the system around it." 26 minutes had passed since Malcolm Trevors took his seat. The aircraft still hadn't moved. On paper, it was a ground hold for traffic synchronization. But every person in first class knew the truth. They just didn't know how to say it aloud. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, not from exhaustion, but from strategy. In stillness, he processed. In stillness, he recalibrated. The silence had stretched so long that even the engine hum, once ambient, felt intrusive. A new message flickered on his tablet. Tier 2, review escalation. Cleared for full activation. Request access to Dignity Matrix logs. He tapped twice and sent authorization. Near the front galley, Camilla Reyes refilled a small pitcher of water, though she didn't need to. Her hands moved automatically, a ritual to fill the silence within her. She kept glancing toward row 2, trying to read something in the body language of the man she had failed. Malcolm hadn't looked at her since returning. She had offered the water with a quiet apology. He had responded with a truth that cut through her like clean glass. It shouldn't take knowing someone's title to treat them with basic dignity. She would remember that line for the rest of her career. She turned, spotted the junior flight attendant. "Layla, returning from the back of the plane," Layla whispered. "Camilla, Frankfurt's ESG board posted something, and the comments are full of videos. Passengers posted the entire exchange." Camilla felt her stomach knot. Her voice cracked as she asked, "Did they mention my name?" Layla nodded hesitantly, a slow breath. This wasn't just about one flight anymore. It was about legacy. Sloane sat with her arms folded tightly against her body, trying to appear smaller. But shrinking couldn't save her. Her phone buzzed again. 32 missed messages, 5 voicemails, 1 from her husband. He had only texted 1 word. Why she didn't reply? How could she? Every message felt like a judgment. Every notification, another nail. She glanced at Malcolm again, still unwilling to meet his eyes. Not because of shame alone, but because his silence forced her to listen to her own noise. A noise she hadn't heard until now. Entitlement. she realized, had an echo. It just took silence to hear it. In row 3C, Deshaun Blake uploaded his third video. This one was different. He wasn't speaking directly to the camera anymore. He was narrating over footage of Malcolm sitting calmly, the tablet in his hand, his posture unshaken. Voiceover. This is what strength looks like. Not the kind that screams, the kind that recalibrates systems, the kind that holds everyone accountable without raising a voice. The video exploded across feeds. Within 40 minutes, it reached 8 million views. Hashtag beggared seat 2A comments flooded in. This man is changing everything without moving a muscle. Why does this feel bigger than just a flight? He didn't get mad. He got even. With data. And the top comment read, "Respect isn't earned by shouting. It's revealed when silence exposes the lie." At Geneva Aviation Ethics Council, a boardroom full of regional advisors debated in rapid succession. We've confirmed his Astra 9 flag was warranted. Do we escalate to Tier 3? Not yet. Let's wait for Altair's official response. But they're still in radio silence. That's the problem. Another advisor, elder and slow to speak, leaned forward and said what others had avoided. What if this was never about the airline? Everyone looked at him. He continued, what if the lesson isn't just for carriers? What if this is about how every institution responds when power doesn't come in the packaging they expect? The room went quiet. No one disagreed. Captain Mahler checked the latest memo on his screen. It was from ESG Ops. 5 lines. Flight 407 may depart under provisional status, subject to post-flight audit and full compliance transparency. His lips pressed together in a tight line. He tapped the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your patience. We've received clearance to depart shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. He paused before continuing. We appreciate your understanding. Sometimes the world moves slowly because something important needs to be noticed. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, Sloane felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't resolution. This was reckoning. For her, the consequences would continue far beyond the runway. She knew it. The foundation would distance itself. Her board seats might be reconsidered. The people who once invited her to keynote luncheons would leave her name off the next guest list. But none of that hurt more than knowing that the only person who truly deserved dignity from her today had received the least. The man beside her hadn't just reclaimed his seat. He had recalibrated the air around her, and she could never return to the comfort of ignorance again. At Langston Group HQ, Malcolm's assistant received confirmation. 4 airports had severed fast-track partnerships with Altair, citing active ethics investigation. Malcolm hadn't called anyone. He hadn't issued a public statement. He had submitted data. And now the world was rearranging itself around the weight of his quiet refusal to be erased. The assistant stared at the terminal for a long time before whispering to no one in particular. I think the system just blinked, back in the air. Camilla moved down the aisle again. She hesitated beside 2A, not to offer anything, just to be present. This time, she didn't speak. Malcolm looked up, and after a brief moment, nodded once. The tiniest gesture, but it was something, a beginning. And that, for her, meant more than any protocol. 37,000 feet above the Atlantic. Malcolm finally closed his tablet. His seat reclined by a fraction. His breathing evened. Outside the window, the clouds glowed with the orange hue of a setting sun. Peace wasn't what he sought, but peace had followed anyway, not because he demanded it, but because he created it, inside himself first, and then, as always, around him, one quiet boundary at a time. The hum of the engines was steady now, but inside the cabin of Flight 407 the air remained thick with silence, not the kind that soothed, the kind that measured, the kind that asked questions no one wanted to speak aloud. How many times had this happened before? How many people had been asked to move quietly, to shrink politely, to disappear calmly, and how many of them had systems to speak for them when they chose not to? Malcolm Trevors rested his head against the window, not out of fatigue, but memory. He thought of a train platform in Boston, age 21, first suit, first briefcase, first invitation to present a data compliance model to a room full of aerospace executives. He had been mistaken for a porter 3 times before the train arrived. No apology, no acknowledgement, just the assumption that dignity had a uniform and his wasn't it. Back then, he had smiled and carried the briefcases anyway. Back then, he thought quiet meant acceptance. It had taken years to understand that silence could also be strategy, that stillness was not surrender, that data could speak when people refused to listen. Somewhere in Washington, D.C., inside a quiet federal compliance hub 2 blocks from the FAA, a woman named Andrea Madsen replayed footage from Flight 407. Her credentials didn't make headlines, but her reach was deep. She worked in a unit few understood, ethics infrastructure oversight. Her job was to study when rules failed, and more importantly, why. On her 3rd playback of the cabin footage, she stopped the frame at minute 14, the exact moment Camilla looked away as Malcolm gestured to his ticket. Andrea stared at it. A pause. Then she wrote 2 words into her secure report file. Pattern confirmed. Below it, she added, recommend immediate Tier 3 audit. Malice not required. Disparity sufficient. Then she sent a short encrypted message. Langston protocol is now inevitable. Back on the plane. Camilla stood near the flight deck doors, staring at her reflection in the polished metal panel. She could barely recognize herself. A week ago, she would have defended her professionalism with pride. Today, she wasn't so sure. She replayed the scene in her mind. Not what Malcolm said, but what she didn't. She had let someone's wealth and whiteness write the rules without thinking twice. She hadn't questioned it. She hadn't challenged it. And it wasn't the first time. It was just the first time it mattered this loudly. When the story echoed, when the silence was recorded, when justice traveled at 37,000 feet, 2 rows back. Deshaun Blake watched as his inbox flooded with invitations. Would you speak about your video? Can you come on air for a quick segment? Your narration of the incident has shifted public perception. He closed them all. He wasn't interested in being famous for witnessing something painful. Instead, he opened a new message and typed slowly. To every person who's ever been asked to prove they belong, I saw you today. Then he posted it. No hashtags, just truth. Sloane turned toward the window. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. A notification chimed again. Another foundation had quietly removed her name from the advisory board. She didn't blame them. For so long, she had thought herself progressive. She had funded scholarships, attended equity summits, quoted Baldwin in acceptance speeches. But none of that mattered in row 2. Not when the test was real, not when the moment demanded more than quotes, and certainly not when she had failed it in front of the world. She looked at Malcolm again. Still, he said nothing. Still, he didn't need to. Because the thing about power is this: the kind that is real never has to announce itself. In a minimalist office overlooking Zurich's skyline, Amira Haas, founder of an ESG fintech firm, finished reading the Langston Group's audit of Altair's ethics failure. She didn't wait for board consensus. She triggered the clause herself. Disengage Altair, freeze holdings, notify all partner networks. A colleague raised an eyebrow. That's nearly 200 million euros, Amira replied softly. Money can recover. Integrity cannot. She paused. And besides, it's already too late. This story will live longer than the airline. In the galley. Layla scrolled through public comments. Someone had written, "This isn't about revenge. It's about record-keeping." Another wrote, "He could have humiliated everyone. He chose to document instead." And another, "The world's changing. Not because people yell louder, but because someone finally started writing things down and made the silence undeniable." Layla closed the app. She looked at Camilla. "We're in the story now," she whispered. Camilla nodded slowly. "We always were." Malcolm glanced down at his armrest. There, barely visible now, was the faint pressure line from where the woman's bag had rested earlier, a mark that would fade by landing. But he knew better than to believe it had ever been about the bag. It never was. It was about assumption, about which bodies belonged in certain seats, about which passengers were granted the full experience of dignity, and which had to ask for it first. He reached for his water, took a sip, then stared ahead as if preparing for something larger than landing. At the United Nations Aviation Equity Forum scheduled 2 weeks later, an urgent proposal was added to the agenda, submitted by 4 ESG boards, endorsed by 6 airport authorities. It was titled The Langston Framework for Dignity Systems in Transit. Its core thesis was short. Dignity must be measurable. Bias must have infrastructure. Ethics must leave footprints. And silence, real silence, must never be mistaken for consent again. The cabin lights dimmed gently. Flight 407 cruised high over the Atlantic now, somewhere between time zones and truths. Dinner had been served. Most passengers picked at their meals, but few truly ate. In row 2A, Malcolm Trevors set down his untouched tray and reached for a pen. The movement was small, intentional. From a side pocket of his leather brief, he pulled out a narrow, linen-bound journal. Not a tablet, not a corporate issue log. A journal, handwritten pages, ink smudged from use. He opened to a blank page, wrote the date, then paused. For a moment, even he wasn't sure what came next. In the galley, Camilla stood motionless, staring at her own hands. They had served thousands of passengers over the years, poured coffee, folded blankets, secured infants into bassinets. But today, those hands had taken something, not physically, but morally. Her hands had moved with quiet obedience to a woman's entitled voice, not because she believed in what was said, but because she was trained to prioritize comfort. Whose comfort? She reached for the crew logbook and turned to the comment page. Her pen hovered. Instead of protocol notes, she wrote, "I failed a man who said nothing, but everything about him demanded to be heard. His silence is louder than I am ready for." She closed the book without signing it. Not yet. In row 2B. Sloane Hargrave finally leaned over. Her voice came out smaller than expected. "Mr. Trevors, may I say something?" Malcolm didn't look at her immediately. He closed his journal, capped the pen, then slowly turned. She hesitated, then continued. "I want to apologize. For what happened? I didn't see, no." Malcolm interrupted gently. You didn't want to see. Sloane flinched. But I do now, she said quietly. Malcolm studied her for a long second, then said, Awareness is not a finish line, Miss Hargrave. It's an invitation, one that comes late, more often than not. Sloane's throat tightened. She whispered, What would you have said if I hadn't taken your seat? He looked back toward the clouds. Nothing, he said calmly, because I never needed your seat. I needed the system to notice who keeps getting asked to move. On the other side of the cabin, Deshaun Blake received a direct message from the BBC. Request for interview. Global broadcast. He stared at it, then closed it. He wasn't interested in being a symbol. He wasn't here to capitalize on someone else's restraint. Instead, he turned his camera on once more and whispered, You don't have to be famous to be followed. You just have to do something right when it's hardest. He posted it without tags. No filters. Just truth. Layla brought a cup of hot tea to Camilla. She didn't say anything. Just offered the cup and stood there. Finally, Layla spoke. You're not the villain. Camilla looked down. I enabled one. They stood in silence. Then Camilla asked, Do you think he'll file a report? Layla hesitated, then said, I think he's already written the future, and it's going to reach further than a report ever could. Camilla nodded slowly, then whispered, Good. In the cockpit. Captain Mahler opened the secure flight system feed. His eyes widened slightly. 5 additional airports had joined the temporary suspension list. Several issued joint statements, pending ethics investigation and Langston Index evaluation. He leaned back in his seat, said to his co-pilot, I think we're flying a story now. His co-pilot gave a half smile. Then let's hope we land it right. At Langston Group HQ, Malcolm's assistant forwarded a message labeled Veritas Thread, active. The message was brief. All data signals from Tier 2 verified. Public Trust Index responding. Secondary protocols queued. Stand by for confirmation of Phase 3. Attached was an internal memo draft. Its title, The Price of Invisible Policies. Back on the aircraft. Malcolm reopened his journal. This time, he didn't write statistics. He wrote names, not of people who harmed him, but of those who watched and said nothing. The colleague on the board who stayed silent when a racial slur was whispered at a gala. The investor who withdrew support after Malcolm refused to make optics adjustments to his team. The man in the airport lounge who looked down when Malcolm was asked to show his boarding pass 3 times. He wrote them down. Not to shame, to remember, because memory, when held quietly but firmly, was sharper than accusation. It taught systems how long people had been watching. Sloane didn't sleep. She sat with her arms around herself like a child who had just discovered that their house was built on sand. The wine in her glass had gone warm. She pushed it aside. Then she pulled out her phone and began typing a public apology draft. She wrote it 5 times, deleted it each time. None of the words were enough. Eventually, she opened her email instead, typed the name of the Langston Foundation director, subject line resignation, message body, not out of shame, but because your mission deserves someone who knew this lesson before the headlines. She hit send, then turned off her phone. The quiet that followed felt heavier than before, but more honest. 2 rows behind, a child asked his father, "Why did that man almost lose his seat?" The father hesitated, then replied, "Because some people think respect is optional." The boy frowned. "Isn't it for everyone?" The father nodded. "It should be." Malcolm overheard, and smiled. Just a little, because sometimes the future speaks softly, and sometimes it's listening when no one realizes. The cabin air felt heavier now, the kind of heaviness that doesn't come from altitude or turbulence, but from unspoken truths lingering between passengers like storm clouds before the first crack of lightning. Flight 407 had entered a kind of stillness, not peaceful, just suspended. Everyone knew something had shifted. No one could yet name it, except Malcolm Trevors. He had always known this silence. He had lived inside it. But this time, he wasn't the only one listening. Back in Zurich, Amira Haas reviewed a new report from the Langston Group's Ethics API. She didn't need the graphs to know what was coming. She'd seen this before in boardrooms where culture was curated, not lived, in brands that sold diversity and delivered denial. Her phone buzzed. It was a video clip, only 7 seconds long. Malcolm sitting silently in his seat as the crew tiptoed around Sloane Hargrave's demand, a man surrounded by performance, choosing stillness. She watched it 3 times, then called her global partners. "Activate non-cooperation," she said. "We follow the data, and the data says this airline is no longer aligned with dignity. No press release, just disconnection. One by one." Camilla sat in the crew jump seat. The tea in her cup had gone cold. Layla sat beside her, wordless. "I keep wondering," Camilla finally said, "what would have happened if he had yelled, demanded, shouted?" Layla blinked slowly. "You'd feel less guilty," she replied, "and people would dismiss him faster." Camilla lowered her gaze, "Because then it would be about tone, not truth," Layla added. They sat together in the soft hum of altitude, not needing anything louder than that. In seat 2B. Sloane fidgeted with the gold bracelet around her wrist. It had been a gift from a board she no longer served. She stared at it like it belonged to someone else now. She turned to Malcolm. "Why didn't you say who you were?" Malcolm looked at her, eyes steady. "Because I wanted to see who you were before you found out." The words landed like stone on glass. Sloane's throat tightened. "I failed." Malcolm didn't disagree. "But what happens next," he said, "is more important than what happened first." Sloane whispered, "Are you going to destroy everything I built?" Malcolm tilted his head slightly. Only the parts built on silence. In a communications hub in Singapore, a Langston integrated AI system triggered its pre-alert. A code appeared on screen: Protocol Veritas, threshold met below it, a timestamp, followed by 4 airport codes: JFK, FRO, SIN, JMB, each marked with a red tag. Ethics compliance suspension, effective immediately. Flight operations frozen, not because of threats, but because of data. The weight of silence was now measurable. Meanwhile, in the back row of first class, a soft ping echoed from the aircraft Wi-Fi. One passenger's newsfeed refreshed, then another. The headlines broke slowly, like sunrise behind fog. 4 global airports cut ties with Altair Airways amid ethical scandal. Langston Protocol activated following in-flight discrimination incident. CEO silent, system loud. Whispers replaced turbulence, the kind of whispers that are careful, because they know they're late. In the cockpit, Captain Mahler received a direct ping from Altair Control. It read, "Do not inform cabin. Do not acknowledge incident. Maintain public calm." Mahler scrolled down. The final line made him pause. "Your contract prohibits discussion of the Langston Protocol." He looked up at the clouds ahead. Then he opened the intercom, not for a corporate statement, but for truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said gently, "we are aware of certain operational changes affecting this flight. Safety remains our highest priority. However, we acknowledge that something greater than aviation is unfolding aboard Flight 407. He paused, then added, "For those of you listening closely, thank you." Malcolm received a silent nod from a man across the aisle. The man was older, dressed in a navy suit, and wore no name tag. He leaned forward slightly. "You built something remarkable," he said softly. Malcolm looked at him. "I didn't build it alone." The man nodded again. "But you made sure it can't be ignored. They didn't need names, because impact doesn't always require recognition. Sometimes presence is enough." Later, Camilla entered the first-class cabin again. This time, not with a tray, but with a folded document. She approached Malcolm's seat. "I don't know if this means anything," she said, "but this is the official incident log. Would you like to review or sign anything?" Malcolm looked up. "Have you reviewed it?" he asked. Camilla nodded. "Then I already have." She stood for a moment, unsure what to do, then added, "You didn't raise your voice, but you raised the floor." He gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile, then said, "That's what systems do when they work. They don't shout, they shift." Sloan opened her laptop. In the search bar, she typed Langston Protocol Origin. She had been too embarrassed to ask before. What she found humbled her. A framework created in response to repeated, undocumented racial denials of service in luxury travel spaces. A system that scored airports and airlines based not on apologies, but behavioral patterns, policy audits, and incident silence gaps. Malcolm wasn't just a man with a name. He was the designer of a system that held memory, a system that didn't forgive until behavior changed. She closed the laptop, folded her hands, and whispered, "Now I understand why you didn't need to explain yourself." In row 2A. Malcolm watched the clouds stretch out in layers beyond the glass. He had known this day would come. He didn't know it would come mid-air, but maybe that was fitting. Maybe justice, too, should learn to fly. The captain's voice still echoed in the minds of the passengers. Not loud, not alarming, but undeniable. He hadn't named names, hadn't pointed fingers, but he had acknowledged something real was unfolding aboard Flight 407. And that was enough to split the cabin into two kinds of people, those who wanted to forget what happened, and those who could never unsee it again. The air didn't return to normal. It evolved at 37,000 feet. Consequences don't land immediately, but they do begin to descend. A ripple moved across the Atlantic, starting in the cockpit, spreading through corporate offices, reaching terminals around the world. In Nairobi, a former colleague of Malcolm's read the news on a cracked phone, standing in line at Jomo Kenyatta Airport. He smiled quietly and muttered to no one. He finally pulled the lever. In San Francisco, an investor watching the story unfold on Bloomberg closed her laptop slowly. "So that's what he meant by accountability infrastructure," she whispered. And in Frankfurt, a regional ethics officer for one of Altair's European partners filed an urgent internal review marked high visibility, immediate reputational risk. Back on the plane, Sloan Hargrave sat in seat 2B with her eyes closed. But she wasn't sleeping. She was rewinding. Every interaction, every raised eyebrow she'd dismissed. Every time she chose comfort over conscience. She opened her eyes and turned to Malcolm. "There's something else I need to say," she whispered. Malcolm said nothing. His calm gave her space. "I didn't just take your seat," she continued. "I made it easier for others to pretend it wasn't yours to begin with." He looked at her for a long second, then said, "That's how systems survive." Sloan nodded, "But not how they heal." she replied. Camilla stood just behind the curtain that separated first class from business. She clutched her phone, open to an article she couldn't stop rereading. It wasn't just about Flight 407 anymore. The Langston Protocol had now been triggered on 3 other flights from the same airline. Similar incidents, different names, same pattern. A reporter from the Atlantic called it a web of comfortable ignorance. And in bold, below the headline, not just one flight, not just one man. Camilla closed the article and looked at her reflection in the oven door. "I was trained to protect the brand," she murmured. Layla appeared beside her, holding 2 coffee cups. "Maybe now," she said softly, "you can start protecting people instead." In the rear galley, Flight Attendant Jonas, who had mostly stayed quiet since the first incident, watched the cabin camera replay. He'd reviewed the footage 10 times now. Not the moment Malcolm was displaced, but the seconds afterward. The faces, passengers looking away, hushed glances, complicity without words. He thought about his own silence. Then he pulled out the crew contact tablet and began composing a note. "To corporate safety and DEI compliance," he wrote, "I need to file an observation. Not just for this flight, but for the last 12. I've seen it happen before. I just never had the courage to log it." He paused, then hit send. Malcolm leaned his head back. Outside his window, the clouds softened as dust settled across the sky. He had known all this would come eventually. The data had been clear for months. The Langston Index flagged multiple rising thresholds. Altair Airways had crossed the line long ago. But he had waited. Why not because he lacked proof? Because proof without patience becomes noise. And he had learned long ago silence, curated with precision, was sharper than protest. But now, the time for silence was closing. On the ground, a massive LED screen in Times Square showed live news updates. A headline blazed across the ticker: "CEO on board of Flight 407 remains silent. Yet 4 airports suspend Altair Airways in under 3 hours." Nearby, a small crowd gathered. A woman in a blazer whispered, "He never needed to say a word." That's the scariest part for them. A man beside her replied, "He didn't destroy them. He just revealed them." And somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a young boy turned to his father. "Is he a hero?" the father thought, then said, "No, he's a mirror." Sloan finally opened her laptop again. This time, not for resignation, but for accountability. She began drafting a letter addressed to her own foundation's board. It read, "We failed, and by we, I mean me. I was the gatekeeper of narratives that made discrimination look like protocol. I can't fix that overnight, but I will no longer fund silence." She signed it, attached documentation of her past decisions, then hit send. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew it wouldn't be denial. Camilla stepped into the aisle, holding a fresh tray of water. It wasn't required. She stopped at Malcolm's seat. "May I?" she asked. He nodded. She set the glass down gently, then said, "I can't undo anything that's already in motion." Malcolm looked up at her. "You're not supposed to." Camilla blinked. He continued, "You're supposed to remember it well enough that it never happens again." She nodded, and for the first time since takeoff, her shoulders dropped slightly, as if memory itself had begun to do the work. At Altair Airways' Central Operations Center, the boardroom lights remained on past midnight. A legal team scrambled to draft a formal statement. Another team reviewed footage from the plane, and a third team argued whether they could sue Malcolm Trevors for non-disclosure of power. It didn't matter, because the world already knew. and because what Malcolm had revealed wasn't defamation, it was documentation. In the final hour of the flight, a hush fell again. Malcolm sat still. Not victorious, not angry, just present. He wasn't the center of attention. The system was, and now it could no longer look away. The lights in the cabin dimmed as the sun began to slide beneath the curve of the earth. Golden hues touched the tops of the seats in first class like quiet forgiveness. But there was no forgetting. Not now. Malcolm hadn't moved much in the last hour. His hands remained folded, his gaze outside steady. He wasn't watching the clouds. He was listening to the weight of the system folding under itself. A new email notification appeared on his screen. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. When the truth echoes, it doesn't need to shout. It just repeats until the room changes shape. Back in Zurich, Amira Haas stood in a quiet conference room where 6 other executives were gathered. None of them spoke for a long time after watching the flight footage. "We've let branding become our ethics," one woman finally said. Another whispered, "That man didn't call for anything. He didn't threaten. He didn't even stand." And yet, Amira finished her thought for her. He brought a multi-billion-dollar airline to its knees with a look. Silence again. Until Amira tapped her screen and said, "Let's finalize the Langston Index expansion across all regional partners. We've delayed long enough. The world isn't waiting anymore." Onboard Flight 407. Camilla sat in the service galley, her hands trembling slightly as she reviewed the updated passenger manifest. She saw Malcolm's name highlighted now in red. A system note had been added. It read, "Tier 0, do not disturb without executive clearance." It was supposed to be a protection, but it felt like a monument too late. She stared at the screen until the words blurred. Layla approached, setting a warm cup of tea in front of her. "He's not asking for protection," Layla said. Camilla sighed. "Then what is he asking for?" Layla sat down across from her and spoke gently. "He's not asking for anything. He's revealing what we've allowed ourselves to ignore." Camilla swallowed hard. "Do you think he'll forgive me?" Layla didn't answer right away. "Maybe, but I think you're asking the wrong question." Camilla looked up. "Then what's the right one?" Layla met her eyes. "Will you forgive yourself?" At headquarters, Altair's crisis response team was imploding. The legal team was split, half pushing to issue an immediate statement, the other half urging silence. The CEO paced the room, muttering, "We didn't see this coming. We didn't know who he was." The communications director replied flatly, "That's the problem. You only care who people are when they can cost you." A quiet assistant entered, holding an envelope. "Sir, this just came through from the Langston Governance Council." The CEO opened it with trembling hands. Inside, a simple sheet of paper. One sentence. "Your airline has failed to meet minimum dignity compliance thresholds in 4 international regions. Effective immediately. All ESG-linked capital investments are frozen. No logo, no threats. Just the result." Back on the plane, Malcolm stood up for the first time since takeoff. Passengers watched, some subtly, others shamelessly. He adjusted his jacket, nodded to an elderly couple seated across the aisle, then walked slowly toward the rear. No entourage, no noise, only gravity following his footsteps. Camilla saw him approach and stood quickly, unsure what to say. But Malcolm simply said, "May I speak with your full crew for 5 minutes?" Camilla nodded. She gathered them silently. Layla, Jonas, the other 2 attendants, even the flight purser. They stood in a semicircle, uncertain, uncomfortable. Malcolm spoke softly. "I won't take much of your time. I know you have procedures to follow, schedules to meet. He looked at each of them in turn. But I want to remind you of something simple. You are not just protectors of procedure. You are guardians of presence. Jonas shifted slightly. You carry the first welcome, the first glance, the first voice. Malcolm continued. And sometimes, without knowing it, you also carry the first fracture. No one spoke. I don't want apologies, he said. I want memory. I want you to remember how easy it is to lose sight of someone when you're busy serving rules instead of people. He gave them one last look. Thank you for your time. And with that, he turned and walked back to his seat. Jonas blinked rapidly. Eyes glassy, Layla whispered. Now we begin. In the cockpit. Captain Muller received one more encrypted ping. A directive. Do not allow disembarkation interviews with media. Divert press upon landing. Offer NDA contracts if needed. He read it twice, then deleted it. Then he opened a new message and wrote something different. Upon landing, I will not obstruct any passenger's right to speak their truth. He hit send, then leaned back in his seat, watching the coastline come into view. They were descending, but something else had already risen. On social media, the world was no longer speculating. Clips from the flight had emerged. Not just the incident, but the stillness that followed. The choice of calm, the precision of silence. Trending hashtag #MagSeat2. A user tweeted, he didn't argue, he didn't shout, he just sat down, and 4 airports stopped working. Another wrote, I want the kind of power that doesn't need to speak to be heard. And one that echoed most loudly, it was never about the seat. It was about whether we believe some people deserve one at all. As Flight 407 began final descent, Malcolm closed his eyes. He wasn't angry. He wasn't relieved. He was simply ready. He hadn't changed anything with fury. He had changed it by refusing to be invisible again. The world could interpret that however it wanted. But for the first time in a long time, the sky didn't feel like silence. It felt like alignment. The landing gear locked into place with a low, mechanical thud. Passengers shifted in their seats. Buckles clicked. But the tension that hovered inside Flight 407 wasn't about the descent. It was about what waited once the wheels kissed the tarmac, and what couldn't be undone. Malcolm adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, gently folding his left sleeve to reveal the brushed steel edge of a fitness band. He didn't wear it to count steps. It was custom-built by his own firm. A biometric sensor that tracked a different kind of rhythm stress load, breath pace, posture stability, and the micro-tremors of decision-making. Today, it had stayed almost completely flat. Not because he hadn't felt anything, but because he had learned to live inside discomfort without feeding it, a gift and a burden. At the front of the cabin, Sloane sat ramrod straight, hands gripping the seatbelt like a rope in a storm. She had seen the headlines, the live ticker, the split-screen chaos across networks, and though she had crafted press releases in 10 different crisis simulations before, none had prepared her for what it felt like to be part of the story. Not the narrator, not the strategist, the problem. Her fingers itched to draft something an apology, a call to action, even a resignation. But no paragraph could undo what her presence had permitted. She whispered into the air, not sure who was listening. If you knew how many boardrooms I sat in and said nothing, would you even accept this version of me now? She didn't expect an answer, but she hoped someone heard the asking. Down in the terminal, airport staff prepared for a different kind of arrival. Not the kind with streamers or red carpets, the kind with cameras, questions, and consequences. Local security huddled in formation, not because Malcolm Trevors requested protection, but because Altair's silence had turned him into a symbol too large for a press embargo. On Concourse A, 3 independent reporters stood holding phones, live streaming 2000s. A hand-lettered sign quietly appeared behind them. It read, "Seat 2A is everyone who's been told they don't belong. No slogans, no chants, just that." And somehow, it echoed louder than a megaphone. Camilla's hands trembled as she collected stray cups from the aisle. Everything had changed, and nothing had. She had watched systems break down before, but not from the inside, not while she stood in the uniform. Layla brushed past her, gently placing a hand on her elbow. "You don't have to be a villain to be part of the harm," Layla said gently. Camilla nodded slowly. "And you don't have to be perfect to be part of the healing." Layla smiled faintly. "That's the part people forget." As the aircraft made its final turn toward Gate 22, a strange stillness settled over the passengers. No applause, no sudden flurry of voices, just breath, quiet and collective. Malcolm exhaled once and unfastened his belt. He stood, reached for his carry-on bag, and paused. He didn't look back at Sloane. He didn't nod at Camilla. He didn't speak. He simply walked forward, each step a ledger, each moment a record. The door opened, light poured in, on the jet bridge. The airport director stood waiting, a tall woman with graying temples and quiet eyes. She offered no smile, only a slight bow of the head. No one else spoke. Cameras clicked. Some passengers tried to film. Others lowered their phones, unsure what moment they were witnessing. Malcolm walked past them all, calm, deliberate, not performing, just existing with the weight of it all. And the message traveled farther than volume ever could. In a private lounge moments later, the Altair CEO waited in a suit 2 shades darker than fear. He had prepared a folder of statements, but the paper felt hollow in his hands. Malcolm entered. He did not sit. The CEO stood to greet him, but didn't extend a hand. He didn't dare. "I'm told. The protocol has been activated," the CEO said stiffly. Malcolm studied him for a moment. "No, the protocol was always active. You just ignored the data." The CEO shifted uncomfortably. "We can respond. Correct course. Clarify intent." Malcolm raised one eyebrow. "It's not your intent that matters. It's your structure. Silence. We built a diagnostic framework," Malcolm continued, "and you treated it like a suggestion." The CEO started to speak, but Malcolm raised one finger slightly. "I am not here for a meeting. I am here to make something plain." He opened his bag and placed a small device on the table. It pulsed blue once. "This is your full audit," Malcolm said. "Behavioral, financial, procedural. You knew. You measured it. You profited from it." The CEO paled. "Is this a threat?" Malcolm looked him dead in the eye. "No. It's a receipt." Back in the terminal, Jonas sat near an unused gate, sipping a bottle of water with shaky hands. He had never seen a man reduce a billion-dollar power structure with silence. He wasn't sure he ever would again. Layla sat beside him, cross-legged, calm as always. "Think they'll change?" Jonas asked. Layla shrugged. "Maybe not today. But they'll remember today every time they reach for someone's arm, every time they scan a name, every time they hear the quiet voice of someone they almost ignored." Jonas nodded slowly. "I just want to do my job better." Layla looked over and said gently, "Then start by seeing people before the seat number." At a news desk in Atlanta, a black journalist sat with tears in her eyes, watching the raw feed from the airport. She whispered into the open mic, What we saw today was not revenge. It was restoration. Her co-anchor asked, "What do you think it means going forward?" She looked into the camera. "It means you never know which passenger carries a mirror instead of a megaphone. And when that mirror is held up, may we have the courage to look." The world didn't stop. Flights continued. Terminals echoed with announcements. Passengers hurried past each other, rolling bags and checking screens. But something invisible had shifted. Across 4 international airports, Altair Airways was no longer present on the departure boards. Terminal monitors, once filled with routes and gates, now showed silent gaps. The absence said more than any protest ever could. It said, "We saw what happened in Seat 2A, and we choose dignity." Malcolm sat in the back of a quiet cafe overlooking the runway. He didn't want a stage. He had never wanted one. The press had followed him after landing, but he hadn't given a single statement. His silence became a statement itself. In front of him sat a cup of tea, untouched. Across from him was Amira Haas, the director of Zurich International, and the woman who had once believed in the Langston Index when it was only theory. "You didn't just prove it works," she said softly. Malcolm looked up. "You proved what happens when it's ignored." He gave a faint nod. "I wasn't trying to make a scene." She smiled sadly. "You didn't. You made history. In a classroom 2 weeks later, a flight attendant training module paused on a freeze frame. It showed Malcolm seated quietly beside the passenger who had denied him his rightful space, the leather bag still occupying the spot. A new instructor turned to the class. "This isn't just about rules," she said. "It's about reflexes, emotional reflexes. What happens when your first thought isn't, 'Is this fair?' but 'Will I get in trouble if I act?'" A hand went up. "What happened to the flight crew?" The instructor replied, "They weren't fired. They weren't praised either. But every single one of them is now required to complete the Langston Empathy Immersion Program." The room was quiet. Someone whispered, "I want to be the kind of attendant who would have offered him the seat before he had to ask." At a press conference days later, Altair's CEO stood before a wall of microphones. He looked hollowed out. He read from a card. "There are moments when silence is a shield, and moments when it is complicity. On Flight 407, our systems and our people failed. Not because of noise, but because of what we were willing to overlook." He paused. "Effective immediately. We are implementing the Langston Protocol across our entire network, not just in name, but in budget, in training, in culture." One reporter called out, "Why now?" He looked up. "Because the sky no longer belongs to the indifferent." Malcolm returned to his firm weeks later. No parade, no meeting, just the hum of an office that respected space and time. He paused outside the entrance before walking in. A plaque beside the door now read, "Langston Trevors Institute for Applied Dignity Metrics." Inside, analysts were building data sets not just for airlines, but for hospitals, hotels, and public agencies. Everywhere people were treated like passengers. Everywhere power had become procedure. And everywhere Malcolm's quiet stance had started something he couldn't stop. Nor did he want to. Sloane Hargrave had stepped down, not because she was forced, but because she realized silence at the top reverberates more loudly than orders below. She wrote a personal letter to Malcolm. She never sent it. Instead, she framed the envelope and kept it on her desk in her new role director of community ethics at a human rights nonprofit. Minso Dadain, a small reminder, power unused is still a choice. Camilla stood in line at the airport one morning and recognized a passenger who looked overwhelmed. A mother, 3 children, a boarding pass with a complicated rebooking code. Camilla stepped away from the counter and gently guided the woman through. She didn't ask what had happened. She just made sure it didn't continue. That evening, she journaled something simple. Today, I didn't fix the system, but I made it bend in the right direction. Jonas returned to work with a new badge clipped to his lanyard. It wasn't about status. It simply said, "See me," not a slogan, a prompt. He stopped assuming who needed help and started asking who hadn't been asked. Small shifts, big ripples, and Malcolm the man in seat 2A never gave a press tour. He never signed a memoir deal. He simply kept building, designing quieter ways to make fairness measurable. He knew he wasn't a hero, but maybe, in the world's quietest way, he had reminded people how to act like humans again. And that was more than enough. In a different city, a father watched the footage of Flight 407 with his teenage daughter. She turned to him and asked, why didn't he just yell? He thought about it for a long moment. Then he answered, because sometimes the loudest thing a black man can do is remain calm. She nodded slowly, and that scares them more. He nodded back, and changes them more. In the end, no single seat mattered. It was what that seat revealed. Who we think deserves comfort, who gets overlooked, and who refuses to disappear just because someone else is comfortable. Malcolm didn't change the world, but he cracked it open, just enough for the light to get in. And that's how the sky changed. One seat, one moment, one man who refused to make noise when the silence finally listened. What started as a silent slight on one man's seat became a national conversation on dignity. Because this wasn't just about first class. It was about first assumptions, about how systems choose comfort over conscience until someone refuses to be erased. Malcolm Trevors didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't humiliate. He simply stood in his truth. And the weight of that truth grounded 4 airports, exposed an airline's broken culture, and sparked a shift far beyond aviation. Camilla chose to unlearn. Sloan stepped down to rise again. Passengers, attendants, and even CEOs had to face the mirror and decide who they were when no one was filming. Because real change doesn't come from outrage alone. It comes from the calm, firm decision to no longer tolerate what was once excused. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes in quiet justice, someone who's ever felt unseen, and someone who still believes silence can be powerful when it holds the truth. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your voice, your presence, and your reflection. That's what helps us build a world that finally sees everyone in seat 2A.